Okay, welcome everyone. This is the beginning of a series of debates that we're going to have about artificial intelligence and how it interacts with us in our daily lives. Today's subject is about facial recognition technology, which happens to be a part of the debate topic that we're debating competitively as well. We have two debaters that will be asking whether or not facial recognition technology should or should not be used in law enforcement and policing. Rick will represent the affirmative to say that we should prohibit facial recognition from being a part of policing, and Adrian here will be the negative. Adrian, senior comm major, Rick, sophomore common criminal justice major. There's a couple of overarching arguments that I want to give a little bit of a spiel on, especially for new folks and things like that. And that is, one of them is we're going to be talking about something that something called biopower that Michel Foucault, this French theorist, talked about. And he talks about how there's all kinds of different ways that either society or the state or different types of institutions kind of control our daily lives. Britt's going to be taking the position that facial recognition technology and surveillance is one of those ways that the state puts biopower upon us. But the other more commonly known or talked about issue with facial recognition technology is that it's often trained to only recognize white male faces, white male middle-aged faces. So me. But it does not always identify people of color correctly. Those are the two main arguments that we'll have on her side, but I'm sure there's a little more as well. I just want to give a little brief spiel about the philosophical aspect as well. And then Adrian will be talking about sometimes we have to make those sacrifices in order to keep ourselves safe, right? And so there's threats of things like terrorism or crime, and that facial recognition technology, as it goes on, will inevitably get better as well. This is a very informal public debate format, so I believe your first two speeches are 5 minutes in length, right? And then you'll have two rebuttals, one at a time, at 3 minutes in length, and then a final plea for 2 minutes in length for each of the two debaters here. And I trust you can time yourselves. We're not going to be overly strict on time either. If they go over or under a little bit, we're not going to slap them on the hand. Oh, and in between the first two speeches will be a cross-examination period as well, where they'll be able to ask questions of each other. And for those of you in my class, it's kind of interesting and fun, hopefully, to see a little bit more cross-examination and usually why people like to watch debates. But without any further ado, I'm going to leave it to my two debaters today.
We affirm the resolution. The United States federal government should ban the use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement. Let's start at the beginning with biometrics. As the automated recognition of an individual's unique characteristics, they reflect the management of our lives and are actively present in multiple aspects of our activity. From security cameras surveilling us to submitting our fingerprint to the DMV, more and more often they are present in the governing of our being. Batija Jana and David Beer, lecturers at the University of York, have found that with the advancements of modern technology, human beings are becoming more and more reliant on this biometric management system. We can specifically see this in facial recognition technology, otherwise known as FRT, and the dangerous effects it can have on our society. For one, FRT exerts the disciplinary power of the panopticon, coined by English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. The panopticon is an institutional design where individuals are not permitted to interact with each other and are in a constant state of surveillance. This power stems from FRT's ability to sort and categorize the information it takes in. Mitchell Gray, a freelance journalist, reveals that it's meant to impose order on the lives of those within, and that there's no limit to how this may affect society as this technology continues to advance. But if it's so dangerous, why are we continuing to develop this tech? Well, that's a result of the aftermath of 9/11. Homeland Security is certain that FRT is a crutch to achieving security. However, this is the wrong narrative to portray as it pushes its repressed paranoia around the radiant other. Kelly Gates, an assistant professor at UC San Diego, discusses how 9/11 led to every federal security legislation, including biometrics. This focus had forced the idea that certain faces could be faces of terror, invoking a paranoid discourse of racialized otherness. This stereotype has led to intensified surveillance and identification, as we are chasing an imaginary target of hatred that constructs terrorism as a problem with only one solution: facial recognition. This takes us into our argument of biopower. Biopower, as identified by 20th century French philosopher Michel Foucault, is this philosophical concept that can be simplified as when an entity has control over us. The more control they have, the tighter our management of life is. In this case, the entity is the United States government, and we are the control. This form of biopolitical control leads us to a militarized security state, with ongoing state killings that can only be reasoned with racist prejudices. On the global end, biopolitical domination can use even the most benign technology for global slaughter. Mitchell Dean, a professor of sociology at the University of Newcastle, relates to us that the same logic and tech applied to the care and development of human life is also pertinent in the destruction of entire populations. If we do not prevent FRT at its root, we must prepare ourselves for a life without privacy and a society of the surveilled. Those who are most at risk, though, are placed in this abuse because of false positives. Trenton Ford, a doctoral candidate in computer science at the University of Notre Dame, explains that false positives are when the algorithm FRT uses falsely identifies a face with that of the criminal, introducing new dangers to law enforcement. Patrick Rocker from the NIST reveals that these false positives are especially high with Black, Indigenous, people of color, and women, with 100 more false positives on average. And not only this, that this technology also misidentifies children, the elderly, and those who don't identify with their cisgender. The only face that this technology can accurately identify is that of a middle-aged white man. And why is that? Because FRT is trained to fail. The photos that are being used to identify are being trained by police officers who fit the mold of that white man. False positives have led to an increase in arrests that perpetuates a systemic violence that we have seen throughout history. This form of racism is visible and invisible because the government models FRT as the solution when really it's just another apparatus of suffering. We need to prioritize placing an end to structural violence because Shashir Dwavidi, an American anthropologist and physician, warns of how structural violence is a death multiplier over time. The accumulated effects lead to worse health and a shorter lifespan, causing 60 million Americans to die prematurely because we are placing a structural barrier that bans minorities from receiving the help they deserve. Will Boisford, a journalist for The Breakthrough, reminds us that we need to fight these global crises that require us to embrace the risks most worth taking.
I want to begin by asking some clarifying questions about the technology itself. How long has this technology existed?
This technology has really been around since like the 60s.
Since the 60s, gotcha. And we're talking about scope here. How many false arrests have been made as a result of facial recognition technology?
False arrests, currently the number is at 7, but other sources are saying that there has been like hundreds of arrests that the government has been kind of pushing under the rug.
Gotcha. When you say like pushing under the rug, like what do you mean by that?
Well, like the Washington Post recently wrote this article about how like there are hundreds and hundreds of like cases where they falsely identify people, but like it's not actually being addressed properly because the government is trying to hide it since facial recognition technology is so new and developing. But even at its like growth, it's still causing harm. That's why we need to stop it at its root.
I see. And these images of people that is currently being used to train facial recognition technology, where do we get these photos from?
But like what we can say is that a lot of these images are that like white face, right? They use primarily male white faces. That's why the algorithm is being trained to fail because they're not putting enough BIPOC faces and female faces and children and elderly and everything I discussed in my speech. They're only putting like these white faces, and that's why the algorithm can more correctly identify that.
Sure, I have issue with that, but let's move on to my next question. Where is facial recognition technology currently being used?
Within law enforcement, that's what we're trying to ban it.
Right. But like, do you have like specific like cities where it's like currently being implemented?
You can like kind of reference New York. I don't know if you've ever watched like Law and Order. But Law and Order actually had kind of an interesting episode on it back in like 2003, where it was already being used to like identify there.
Yeah.
And in California, and even in cases in Nevada, it's everywhere.
And I do want to get to this final question here. You talk about biopower and how it restricts our ability to do things. Is that correct?
Yeah.
What am I unable to do or less likely to do as a result of facial recognition technology?
Everything.
Everything.
Biopower restricts the complete management of your life. The government has control. The more control the government has, the more we are stripped of our most basic rights.
Right. I understand theory, but can you give me an example? Just one example.
We can talk about like our freedom of speech, right? You go to a protest, your face is identified, you're arrested. That limits our First Amendment rights.
Okay. And how is that different than, you know, simply being identified or ID'd by an officer?
Because that's not evidence. You need evidence to be convicted of a crime. It's called probable cause.
Okay. Well, we're out of time there. First of all, thank you everyone for showing up. I'll start my speech. I'm going to start by doing something that is a bit rare in politics, and I'm going to begin by telling you all the truth. On September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people lost their lives because of a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. Those lives were precious and irreplaceable. And while we mourn those losses, we also use the event to scapegoat people from the Middle East. People that were called terrorists not because of their involvement with crime, but rather merely having the same skin color and the same religion as the perpetrators. And as I speak to you all in the next few of these speeches, remember these words. We cannot change the past, but we can choose what to do in the future. When I tell you all that terrorism is a massive threat to America, I do not mean some caricature of a foreign invader from foreign lands. The truth is that political violence, the recent rise of which Reuters last month described as the biggest since the 1970s, has increased so rapidly, not from foreign invaders, but from everyday citizens like you and I. 300 cases since the Capitol was stormed on January 6, 2021. When I tell you that facial recognition technology is key to stopping that violence, that experts say disrupt our society, I do not mean we must over-police already marginalized communities. The truth is that FRT, according to a research conducted this year, facial recognition technology has already been used and has been shown to reduce violent crime rate while not increasing the amount of violent arrest rates in these cities. My opponent obscures the truth when she talks about biopower. These biometrics and these photos are not collected for FRT, but rather your information has already collected. I asked this question during cross-examination. Where do these photos come from? And my opponent did not have a clear answer for you all. The truth is that if you have a driver's license with your picture, if you've ever been fingerprinted, if you've ever been to the airport, if you've ever done like a 23andMe or something like that, Ancestry.com, you already have your photo in the system. Your data has already been collected. All this technology does is sort through it, and it sorts through it better and more accurately than anything else. Way better than some random TSA surveillance officer. My opponent obscures the truth when she says that facial recognition technology has a high false positive rate. According to Business Wire in 2021, Clearview AI, the AI primarily used by law enforcement officers in the United States, has become nearly perfect. In tests, the worst score it received was a 99.4% accuracy rating. Even in international versions, like the AI produced by the Nihon Electric Company, the false positive rate was 1 in 12 billion. That is an insane number to think about. And if you brought that up at any surveillance conference, any law enforcement conference, those would be miracle numbers. That would be advertising numbers. The truth is obscure when my opponent says that innocent people go to jail because of FRT. The truth is that the system still requires a police officer to make the final judgment call, the same as if we didn't have this technology. Facial recognition technology is also helping with the misidentification problem with eyewitnesses. The truth is that I would rather let advanced technology identify me as me, rather than let some stranger in a parking lot who might confuse me for some long-haired brown person of some other name. Because the truth is that according to the Forefront Criminal Justice Reform Group Innocence Project, the overwhelming majority of wrongful convictions that were later exonerated happened because of faulty eyewitness accounts. Let's put it this way. You're all listening to me speak. You've been listening to me speak for about the last 4 minutes here. If I walked up to you tomorrow, or the next day, or maybe next week, would you be able to accurately remember who I was or what my name was? That is a huge problem, and facial recognition technology solves that problem. The truth is we have done a lot of awful things in America in the guise of national security and crime prevention. But I would be lying if I said facial recognition technology would not solve those problems. Thank you.
Okay. Let's start at the top. So you're saying that terrorism is a massive threat, right?
Yes.
When was the last case of like a mass terrorist attack on the US?
Sure, I'll say January 6, 2021.
How many people died?
No one died. The point of a terrorist attack is not necessarily to take the most number of lives, but it is rather to make people feel unsafe or to potentially push a political agenda.
How about when we lost the most lives? What was the big one?
The big one, I mean, if we're talking about pure numbers here, one of the largest terrorist attacks in America was of course 9/11.
9/11. And after 9/11, do you think that the US government has amped up their technology?
Yeah, of course, technology is only improved over time.
Improved or amped up, like gone up? We have used a lot more than we did before.
I'm allowed to say that, okay. Improved and increased the number of.
Sure, but increasing the number of and we have improvements, don't we also have like negative impacts?
Sure, and
Like we can't all be good, right? Or like we wouldn't have terrorism.
it's a bit of a leading question, right? Because like I can't tell you how much terrorism would exist in a world that doesn't exist. But like you brought the numbers up to me and you said that only 7 people have been falsely
With
identified.
hundreds of cases swept under the rug, yeah, sure.
Sure.
So like, on to the next thing, you talk about how like photos come from like driver's license and DMV, all of that. What about cases of like immigration where they're not in our system? How is this stopping like crime from immigrants, for example?
Gotcha. Well, first of all, like immigrants can still receive like identification and like stuff.
If their pictures aren't in the system.
Right. So these photos still exist, and it is very easy for some person at a 3-letter agency to identify you to a person to an identity. No, I think that's a bit of a leading question.
Okay, why? Like, could you explain yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So you're talking about crime from immigrants, right? And that's kind of near or there. Like neither of us really present like statistics about crime from immigrants. In fact, I think that talking about crime from immigrants is maybe like the form of like racism and ostracization that you seem to criticize. But like, I don't have any numbers for you about like crime that was specifically stopped from immigrants.
I mean, I don't think it's a form those from like driver's licenses, right? But a lot of immigrants don't have that, so are we going to falsely identify immigrants as well if they get caught? About protecting the people, not hurting them. Okay, about a minute.
You want a minute? Yeah, sure, you can have a minute. There's someone who needs the sign-in sheet anyway. Okay, where is the sign-in sheet? Oh, it's not, okay. All right. I'm going. The first email.
This one's 4 minutes, I think?
Three.
Oh, 3 minutes? Okay, I'm on. Sorry. Okay. That's fine. Thank you. First off, my opponent's entire terrorism argument is just another example of this fear mongering that I spoke of prior. They speak of the attack on the Capitol, but no lives were actually lost. Yes, you can say that a big terrorism attack is when a lot of fear is actually invoked into people. But it's also an example culturally of when lives are being lost. There is more lives actually being affected by this technology than what he's trying to say the technology will have assistance for. Another thing that the US has been consistently portraying culturally is as all Muslims as terrorists since 9/11. This directly reveals my point about structural violence. By believing this fear-mongering and propaganda that is being shown about terrorism, we are developing FRT as a weapon that reflects negatively on the lives of others. You can refer back to my Leviti evidence on premature death and the death multiplier. It should also be duly noted that this domestic terrorism that my opponent talks about is more of a common threat than this international fear. And secondly, onto their responses with biopower. There isn't any misunderstanding occurring. FRT is being used to identify, verify, monitor, and arrest, even under false accords. That is what my opponent fails to address. He only talks about the identification part. He doesn't actually speak about how this identification is being used to harm. The reason I brought up immigration in my past speech is because immigrants are also being falsely identified. We're also seeing those numbers go up. It's not an idea of racism that all immigrants are coming to attack us. No, it's about protecting all of the people who are living within this country and this technology that is continuing to hurt us. And my argument on false positives is the perfect clash with this evidence. Since the development of FRT, the ACLU reveals that there have been at least 7 wrongful arrests, and the number is certain to increase as we continue to implement it in the system. He says that this isn't a big enough magnitude, but that is 7 lives, 7 worlds, 7 families, 7 people. That should matter. On top of that, the technology is underdeveloped and poorly created. It, however, is expanding at a startling rate and is a choker to US citizens. It is nowhere near perfect, as my opponent claims, especially when the 7th arrest was as recent as this year. Facial recognition technology is relying on an algorithm that only recognizes so many faces and often confuses certain features. And finally, the arguments are clear. FRT is the direct causation of false positives. By removing FRT, there will be no technology that falsely recognizes these individuals. There is no weapon for a police officer to abuse. That solves for my opponent's concern. Therefore, by removing FRT, we are also diminishing the modern technology that traps us in this panopticon, and that solves for biopower. This is not a try or die situation. This is a matter of removing a poisonous tree at its root.
Did they?
Let's begin. Now, I'd like to tell you all about how I felt during January 6th, 2021. As I was watching the news roll out about how people were invading the White House, looting through things, causing mass destruction. The thing on my mind wasn't, I hope no one dies. It was an acceptance that the law and order in the United States had already fallen apart, regardless of whether or not someone had died or not. That is terrorism. My opponent wants to talk about numbers, but fails to see the grand picture of why terrorism is used in the United States to strike fear into left-leaning people, people who look like me, people who belong to any sort of minority group. The point of January 6th was not to simply wipe out every single person who disagreed with them, but rather to strike fear. And that is why terrorism is still real and must be addressed today in the United States because of that political violence. My opponent comes up here and tells you about how that identification is being used to harm and about how immigrants are being falsely identified. But let's follow this logic further. If you believe my opponent and you believe that you cannot be identified because you are an immigrant, your photo is not in the database, then you don't have anything to fear as a result of facial recognition technology. This doesn't identify you. However, if you believe me and say that it can accurately identify you, even if you are an immigrant and tie you to an identity, then you must believe that it is a good thing that this technology is so accurate, that we have a 1 in 12 billion false identification rate. These things are good. My opponent's case kind of falls apart when we think about the logic of it. When we talk about these 7 wrongful arrests that have happened since the 60s, I do not mean to say that those 7 lives that were ruined as a result were simply just a small 1-digit number, excuse me, but rather it pales in comparison to the 300 cases of political violence that have happened since 2000 or 2021. And additionally, my opponent says that one of these cases happened this year, right? One person was falsely attributed to a crime and misidentified. That is unfortunate. I think that even if we believe facial recognition technology is perfect, it can make mistakes. I can accept that much. However, that is way less than the 50 political violence cases that have happened this year. We must do something about the rise of political violence in the United States. And if you believe that facial recognition technology is not as evil inherently as my opponent wants you to believe, then please do not ban it.
Their last speeches should be like a 2-minute final plea, right? And whenever you're ready.
When we are weighing the benefits versus the negatives against FRT, we should go back to this question of ethical morality. It's about if we should allow ourselves to continue to ignore how this technology is mistreating and targeting everyone who doesn't fit into the system's profile. Or if we should use this technology to create this false sense of safety and security that the government is continuing to perpetuate upon us, when actually, just like my opponent talked about, these attacks are still happening, and we've had this technology for 80 years. Or 60 years, sorry. We're not actually seeing a development. We're not seeing a change. We're seeing the FRT become more of a chokehold on BIPOC, women, the elderly, children, but we are not seeing how it's actually causing a benefit to society. We're not seeing how many dangerous criminals were actually put away, or how this is actually affecting our society. What we are seeing is, again, talking about biopower from Michelle Foucault. We're seeing this chokehold that is continuing to tighten and hurt us because the government is having more and more control. It's falsely arresting more people. It's profiling others. It is targeting people who are supposed to be causing the most damage. That is what we need to worry about today. Because the more power we give to the government, the less power we have for ourselves, the more rights that will be stripped away. And that is a concern. That is not only a concern, that should be the main concern, which is why we cannot allow this technology to continue to happen in our society, because it's only going to further hurt us. Because if this technology was so good, we wouldn't have experts such as Trenton Ford from Notre Dame. We wouldn't have Shashir Dwavidi, who is an American philosopher. We wouldn't have so many names screaming for an outcry. Because right now what is happening is this technology is continuing to hurt us. It's happening in Nevada. And if we don't stop it, every single person in this room could become a victim. Thank you.
Let's begin. Let me all tell you about the story of the history that we've seen in light of facial recognition technology. My opponent says that it started in the 60s, and in the many decades that have followed, may have had a rocky start. But the evidence shows that it has gotten incredibly good over time, nearly perfect. These political violences that have happened as of late are regrettable, and I understand that my opponent does not think that these are worth addressing. But the truth is, when we're talking about the benefits of facial recognition technology, we have to look at the 300 political violence cases that have happened after the events of January 6th. We have to address the 50 of which that happened this year alone. We have to address the fact that at the end of the day, facial recognition technology does not hand you a warrant. It is a human being, a police officer, that hands out at the end of the day. We are removing as many of those human errors in law enforcement from eyewitness accounts, from political insurgents. All of these things are heavily reduced when facial recognition comes into play. And that is the most important part. My opponent wants to come up here and tell you that there are no benefits to facial recognition technology whatsoever, saying that, oh, my opponent can't tell you how many terrorist events have been stopped as a result. But the truth is that facial recognition technology is helping to alleviate some of the most documented issues with the legal system. The biases in policing, eyewitness accounts and their faulty memory, the rise of political violence. All of these things will go down if facial recognition technology is allowed to continue in the United States. Thank you.
Oh, basically the type of things that we're going to be doing through this next series of debates about AI, and hopefully, we learned a little bit. Right, we enjoyed watching a little bit of confrontation and in arguments and things like that. And much like when we're in practice debates, I don't decide winners. You can decide that for yourselves. But I think this is only one way that this technology is going to be affecting us for a long time. It ain't just about ChatGPT writing our papers, right? There's a lot of things going on. Good and bad, with artificial intelligence. And I want to thank them for all their very hard work.